Anine, hello, how are you? The sun today was kind of like very pointed. It was like, because you're like swirling around in the wind, so you can just pull that heat inside much easier. So I'm an Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation, which is a little island in Georgian Bay that we call the Caribbean of the North. It's chillier, but just as pretty. And I think still, and also has that kind of laid-back attitude that islanders seem to have. I am a wolf. I'm from Wolf Clan, which means that I think about being critical and what criticality means all the time, because we're supposed to be strategists. And we're also supposed to be great crisis managers. So I'm the person that comes in like a fireman and like puts out a fire. I also come in like a fire starter, and I light fires, but never at the same time. So I think a lot about that in terms of what my role is in life and how my clan sort of helps me figure out what that is. I come from a very large family of Anishinaabe. On my mother had 19 kids, and I'm the baby. And so it ranges from me all the way to my oldest siblings who are in their 60s. And so when I was born, our house had some of my brothers and sisters, a lot of nieces and nephews. It was a very, very full house. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had a lot of love. And I just remember my mom being somebody who worked really, really hard. We didn't have a washing machine, so she used to wash all of our stuff, like with her hands. And I just remember putting like white, like when she was doing the whites, and how white they were, hanging on the line, blowing in the wind. My other sister always tells this story of one time some kids were running by and they dirtied all the white sheets. And she was just like, my poor mother, like she's gonna have to wash all these sheets again. But these are the kinds of actions and things that she did without complaint or without looking for anyone to say anything to her about doing it or doing a good job. This is just kind of the things that she did. And I'm saying this because I think that this is probably the beginning of my understanding of what being critical is. I've learned from her in these early years. Can you all hear me? And it's okay? All right. Let me know if I've got ear issues, so I can't hear myself very well, so I can't tell if I'm projecting or if I'm dropping into like a cloud of water. So just yell if it's getting too quiet for the back there. So I was thinking about a lot on the way here about my mother's kind of personality and how our life was hard, for sure, a lot of hard work, but also the way that she still maintained a kind of kindness and a sweetness, a gentleness through all of that. And I was thinking about how easy it is when life is hard to become angry or bitter or aggressive or all those kinds of ways of being. They're perfectly legitimate responses to the shit life gives us. And for Indigenous people, we have centuries of shit to deal with. So I'm not saying anything against those responses, just so you know. They're all valid responses. I'm just wanting to talk about one specific way to respond to the situation and how it has shaped my way of thinking about what being critical is. So I have learned a lot from watching how she's addressed hardship. So when I was 5, she came, she was away, what I call her sabbaticals, which is when life would get too hard, she'd have to go away for a bit and then come back. the police came, and they removed me and my 2 brothers and my 5 of my nieces and nephews into a foster home. And I was thinking about the day that she came to bring me like a new blue dress. And it was very pretty. It had flowers, little blue flowers. And the reason that I was getting dressed up is because we were about to go to court. So in Canada, after residential schools, which people are just starting to learn about, I'm not going to talk about residential schools today because that's not, I feel like we need to also understand how it's extended past that. We had the 60s scoop, which is technically what I'm the end of. 60s scoop started in the 60s and went to 1985. And it's where kids were taken from Indigenous families and adopted out. They were adopted to America, they were adopted to Canadians, they were adopted all over to non-Native and specifically white families. So it was another attempt to create within us a desire to be white Canadians or white Americans. And what we were doing in court was trying to make sure that I didn't get adopted out because of my age. So my 2 older brothers were okay because they were 13 and 14, so nobody wants teenagers. They just don't want to adopt teenagers. It's a sad fact of this life. But a lucky one maybe in some ways. But I was 5, so I was up for adoption, and my mother really didn't want that to happen because she wanted the chance to get me back. So we went to court, and I just remember sitting in the courtroom and her talking to me, like us talking, quietly talking beforehand, and she wasn't a very chatty woman. And then sitting there and watching this courtroom shrink her, like the way that it operates, how it talks to people, the kind of knowledge that it honors, the way that it saw her, the way that it treated her, and I saw her shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, this beautiful, strong woman. That was my mother. And I think in that moment, that's what created something in me that's been there forever, which is the desire to make sure that we don't build a world where that happens anymore to anyone. She won that battle, thank God. Actually, God's got nothing to do with it. If anything, God's part of the problem. So she won that battle partially. So I became a crown ward, which means that the state became my mother and father. She still had an opportunity to try to win me back, but in a system that is already stacked against you, it's really hard to get your kids back in that system. As I got older and I understood how horrible most of the families I lived in were, I was like, so why is it they think that these people are better than my own family if I'm experiencing these horrible things? So I had to understand what that's about. And one of the things I came to understand is that class in this society is also infused with racism and colonialism. That those 3 things are a large part of our child welfare system. They're a large part of why we take kids out of Indigenous families' homes. They see poverty as a personal failing, as a failing of a parent. And they don't see that poverty is something that was instituted through colonialism. It's a policy in this country to keep Indigenous people poor. It was a policy started in the 1800s and has continued all the way through to now. So I want to talk about that for a second, just to bring you right down. And then we'll bring you up. So when I think about the history of how we got here, I think a lot about animals. And I think about the buffalo, I think about the beaver, I think about the caribou, I think about the elk, I think about the moose, and how our relationship with these animals was central to our welfare and our well-being and our wealth. And they were relationships. And so you get to the 1800s, and right after 1963, so 1763, sorry, way back. I was born then, 1763. I remember this time very much like it was yesterday. The French and the English were fighting. And I was an ally to the British at the time. Anishinaabe were allies. So after that war ended, our power as an ally began to diminish. So 1763 is the Royal Proclamation. This is the one document in Canada where it says, and it was a British document, that had to have a section on Indigenous people, about the Crown's relationship with Indigenous people. They couldn't not have that in there because we were having huge meetings with each other. Our nations were joining with each other, ready for a big fight. There were leaders like Pontiac, Tecumseh, there were a bunch of people, Big Bear, there were people who were gathering together different nations and forming confederacies, larger confederacies, because they wanted the Crown to honor its commitments to Indigenous people around the land. So they couldn't be ignored. So we get this clause that says no land in Canada can be taken, sold, anything except to the Crown. And the only way that that can happen is through a treaty. We had treaties prior to that, prior to 1763. This is why they use the word treaty. This is why they have this idea in their mind. It's an Indigenous idea. It comes from wampum. One of the oldest wampum in Canada is from this territory, from Mi'kmaq territory. It's from the 1500s, and it's with the Holy See. And in that wampum, we are such visual people. This is also some of our artwork. But there's a window in that wampum. And so you see the Mi'kmaq holding hands with the I'm so not religious. Who's the head of the Catholic Church? Pope. The Pope. So the Pope guy is over here. And they're holding hands. And there's a relationship being built, like a contract. It's a contract. It's a law. But there's a window that the Mi'kmaq can go out of. So it's like an exit point. So it's like if you break this, we can leave. We can also not, we don't have to become Catholic. You know, this is our window. We can do our own thing. So all the wampum actually have these kinds of aspects to them about when the relationship is broken. Anyway, so this is where the treaty comes in with the Royal Proclamation. I can go on and on about wampum. You should learn everything you can about wampum, and you should learn the wampum of the land that you live on, because they're binding for life. So you're all bound by these agreements, whether you were born here or not. So, Royal Proclamation, 1763. How the hell am I going to get up to 2017 by 45 minutes? So, in 1763, you have the beginning of paper treaties. And as the paper treaties are spreading across the nation, our people are some of the first paper treaties, and the Anishinaabe. And we're spreading word that they're not so great. So we're spreading that word westward. And we're all telling each other they don't really hold up to their end of the bargain. So by the time you get out west, what you have is a commissioner who has a pre-written treaty. So when they're negotiating with First Nations, they're not listening. They have a pre-written treaty. They know what they want from Indigenous people. They want the land. They know what they're willing to give. They don't give a shit about the negotiations. So the negotiations go on, and they're done according to Indigenous practices. They're done through feasting, through ceremony, and through days and days of negotiation until everyone kind of reaches an agreement. So when we talk about the spirit and intent of treaties, we're talking about those negotiated things, those things that we ceremonialized, those things that were cemented between us and were agreed with the truth of our words, the truth of our voice, and the truth of our hearts. Non-Native people, the commissioner took that written treaty that wasn't agreed to, went back and just logged it in as if that's what was agreed to. So we're still stuck in this place of disagreement, fundamental disagreement about what was agreed to in the treaties. The second part of that is because the West had already learned how the Crown did not follow through on its obligations and its promises. People wouldn't sign the treaties, or they wouldn't take reserves. So part of the treaty process was that you had to go and pick out a piece of land. So you'd be like, okay, this is the land that I want. You guys can do your stuff over here. So as they're doing this, they realize, well, people don't want to give up mobility. Indigenous nations still wanted to travel. They still wanted to move freely in their own lands. They still wanted to hunt. They still wanted to gather. They still wanted to have their ceremonies. So what do? What is the linchpin for that? Food. Food's the linchpin for that. Our ceremonies are based in our relationships to these particular animals that are based in our land. So as you see the building of the RCMP and the building of the train coming out west, you have the RCMP with their guns out the train windows, killing buffalo freely on the plains. And then you have in our archives, which should be in our history books, these pictures of piles of bones, buffalo bones. There's a number of things with that. One, it's a policy of starvation. Two, that meat was just rotting away in the land. So to have the energy of that kind of violence against one of our relatives, we still live with that as a people. We carry that. We have that relationship that needs to be fixed and healed. And there are artists, one in particular that I just did a show with, Adrian Stimson, who's Blackfoot from Siksika and in Alberta, and he has done a lot of work around making connections between the extermination of the buffalo and the colonization of his own people, and the amount of population, the amount of people that were killed also within his own people through starvation, through disease, and through colonial policies. This is why we call it genocide. We call it genocide because that's what it is. Don't be afraid to call it that. Don't be afraid of that word. It just names something. It says what it is, and we can move on from there. But if we keep denying what it is, you never move on, you know? Even Freud knew that. Denial sucks balls for moving on. So what you have are communities that were starved into signing treaties and starved into taking reserves. And by the time you've broken somebody's power that way, there's not a lot of way that your ground for negotiation is very weak. And even in international, so I always say, and some of the Western leaders do not agree with me, we have a difference of opinion. I always say that we should be renegotiating all those treaties because they were signed under duress, and in international law, a treaty that's signed under duress is not actually law. So they should all be renegotiated and negotiated according to the spirit and intent of the treaties of the people that live on those lands. So that's a big action that we could all do going forward. There's people who, we have the oral histories of the treaties. My nation is going through this right now. We're going through the courts. And we have people doing testimony constantly in the court system, saying what the treaty means, who was sitting at the table, what did they say. So these things are passed down from, there are people who are charged with remembering these stories. They're charged with remembering that history. And so it's always shocking in a Western system for people to have that kind of knowledge. And in the Western court system, that knowledge is hearsay. So it's not considered to be valid knowledge, even though from an Indigenous perspective, it's the most truth, because Jim said it, and Jim said it, John was sitting next to him, and John told me, and Jim told, so it's like goes down, and we're all charged with remembering exactly what was said and done and agreed to. So one of the basis that underlines these systems, speaking of criticality, because when I was young, I wanted to change the system. So in my mind, I thought that meant going into it, like joining it and fighting from inside that system. But to fight inside that system, you have to become something different. And it's an adversarial system. It's based on two people arguing from their own side. So you have to argue well, you have to be critical in that sense. You have to, lawyers are some of the most critical people I've ever met in my life. They're amazing arguers. So I went and did moot court. I did all this stuff around law. I still read a lot of law because I think it's important. Western democracies are obsessed with it. So when you start going into that, you start to feel your whole being change. So I no longer think about the person I'm talking to. I think about your words, the argument you're making, and I'm finding a way to trip you up, to make my point, to get through whatever it is you're presenting in front of me, and to get where I want to go. It's super based on an ego. Super based on thinking of the self as a complete ego. It's super based on immediate. It's like what I want right now and what I can accomplish right now. It has no vision for the past and no vision for the future. The only vision for the past it has is one based on precedent. So as long as somebody else prior to me won something, I might be able to win something now. So your comportment changes. I became super argumentative. I still really love to argue, especially if I'm drinking with a bunch of my philosophy buddies, but it's a private pleasure. I don't really want to create a world based on that. So I thought a lot about that, and then I did an undergrad in philosophy, and philosophy is very much based in the same system. It's based on, and I was the only woman and the only woman of color in that room. So it's all white men, young white men, who are trying to prove to other white men at the front of the class that they are, really good. So it's an interesting system. And I was in Native studies at the same time, and I was in cultural studies. 3 very different ideas of what being critical means. And this is sort of how I came to be what I am anyway, because I just can't sit still in anybody's system. I hate them all. So in philosophy, you use reason and logic, which is also what law is based on. You use reason and logic. The mind is the controller of the body, of the emotions, and of society. A rational decision and a rational discussion is a proper and good one. In Native studies, we worked a lot with elders, and actually we had elders who were getting degrees based on their level of knowledge within Indigenous knowledge. That doesn't happen anymore. They got rid of that. It's unfortunate. We were beginning like a revolution there. So somebody like Edna Manitowabi, who is one of the higher-ups in the Medeawin, which is an Indigenous Anishinaabe spiritual lodge that I do not belong to for specific reasons, but I learn from people who belong. She received what is the equivalent of a PhD for reaching a 6th degree Medeawin. So how do you reach 6th degree? So in Mede, you have to go on a journey. You have to deal with your stuff, like you have to go through some kind of change within yourself. Self-knowledge has to increase. And you have to memorize songs, dances, stories, and histories. So this is how you move through. So 6 degrees, she knows a lot, basically. But not only that, her own balance within herself and her own knowledge of herself allows her to be able to give that to somebody else. So if you remain out of balance and you're unhealthy and all that kind of stuff, you can't actually help anyone else. You can't teach them. You can't get them anywhere. But the Western system, that's not true. You can be the most unhealthy asshole in the world and succeed and go right to the top. Look at the President of the United States. So none of that kind of self-knowledge is at all needed. You don't even need to be smart. And you can sexually abuse women. So these are some of the contradictions that sort of appeared to me going through that. And I was interested in the spaces that were being created in an academic environment like Mount Allison. Affective spaces, spaces of the body, spaces of emotion, spaces of ceremony. What kind of knowledge is that? And what does it produce in the world? Then you move into cultural studies, which was my third place. There, they're kind of like resentful philosophers. No, I'm just kidding. I always thought they should read some philosophy. But anyway, but it's like thinking about society and criticizing it. So it's about diving through the masks that we all wear and that society wears to pretend it's an unhealthy place, but to show how unhealthy it really is. So it's useful. It's useful. It's a useful kind of criticality. I taught it to my son when he was growing up. The first time he came home, really upset. He was wearing nail polish. And he was like, kids are making fun of me. They're calling me names. And I was like, do you like the nail polish? And he's like, I love my colors. It's like, I love my nail polish. And I said, can you put up with the names for like 3 days? Can you put up with all the crap you're going to get? And I told him how bad it might get. Because this society is afraid of difference. And it has this like heteronormativity that they're just like fucking fighting so hard to hold on to. But it's dying, it's going. So he's like, okay, Mom, I can do it. I can do this. And I said, what you need to see is their fear. You need to see what they're afraid of. You need to see them as these vulnerable beings who are really messed up and it's not totally their fault. That might help you get through this moment. I said, don't punch them in the face. Because that was his dad's response. It's like, just hit them. They'll never talk to you. They'll never do it again. I was like, oh, man. I was like, actually, that would be a good contradiction. Wear a dress, have some nails, and then punch the shit out of them. So he comes back after 3 days, just bounding off the bus. And he's like, you were right. They stopped. It didn't happen today. He's like, it's done. And so he created a space of freedom for himself. But it was hard won, it was precarious, and it was painful, which is something we do all the time. So kudos to him. And then he came home one time, I think it was like grade 5. And it was like the 5th year in a row where they had the same Thanksgiving project where they have to talk about how the Native people helped the settlers. And every year, I would give him a pile of books that he would take to the teacher. Every year, I didn't go in and save him. I always said he has to learn to stand on his feet. So I'm a hard mom, I'm sorry. But anyway, so he comes home, and he's like, Mom, they're doing it again. He's like, this year, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do the damn project. I'm going to make a little, what do they call this, maquette of the settlers and the natives having food and helping each other out. So he's like, I do not want to be critical anymore, Mom. I don't want to do this anymore. He's like, I'm tired. And I was like, it's grade 5, poor little guy. So I was like, okay, that's your choice, I understand. It's exhausting doing this critical work for everyone else in the room, for the teacher, for all the students, to push to have this space where your history is acknowledged, where your way of being is acknowledged. And so he did his project. He went into school, and he was standing at the front with it. And I heard this secondhand through him and through the teacher. And so he just drops it on the ground. He's like, I can't do it. And then he's like, I can't teach your colonial history. And then he walks to the back, and he goes to the door. He's like, I'll take myself to the office. But I'm talking about our children. This is the work our children are doing in our schools. This is the work we're all doing in these institutions. There's a lot of labor for these little ones, a lot of labor for us as parents. So what the treaty is it's a partnership. It's a relationship based on friendship, trust, honesty, integrity. That's the part that would help. We wouldn't be doing all the labor ourselves. Even right now, I'm doing the labor for you. Fuck thank yous. I'm just kidding. Thank you. When we were talking recently at the Art Gallery of Ontario, where I work, about talking. Okay, I was pushing for an Indigenous space there, one with real meat, real power, which means that Indigenous people have to be at the leadership table. It means Indigenous people have to be part of the large thinking around strategies, around priorities, around even marketing, even space, decisions about how space is used. So up to that point, and a whole lot was made out of it when I got the first position, which was the assistant curator. You know what an assistant curator does? Everything a curator does, but with no power. And less pay, basically. But it was a start, right? It was a way we could create an opening so that once I'm in the door, I'll create more openings because I'm a wolf. This is what I'm supposed to do. So I'm talking to them about this, and there's real genuine inability to understand how it will work, right? Like, how will this work? This is where Canada's at as a whole. Like, how would it work if we acknowledge that Indigenous people have an inherent right to the land? How would it work if we did reparations for all the damage done? How would it work if we equalized all the wealth that Canada has created and the poverty that Indigenous people have held in order to make that happen? How would it work if we rebalance that out? These are the kinds of questions that we're asking. So I'm a strategic person, so I'm like, what could I accomplish right this second? And that doesn't require me to lose my integrity and doesn't require me to compromise too much, or not at all. I'm not really good at compromise, to be honest. That's why I'm really hard to date. Should ask my partner, it's true. So I talked to, they were going to put a woman in charge of Canadian. She was going to get a, what do you call that when you go from one level to another? Promotion. She had been there for 10 years, worked under many men. So I was in full support of her getting this position. And then I said to her, I said, now's a good time for us to think about the relationship between Indigenous and Canadian. What could we model it on? How could we change the system so it is actually a vision that suits Indigenous people as much as it suits Canadians? So I talked to her about using the treaty as a way to design the department, which meant, if you take it seriously, that I had to have an equal amount of power. I had to be at the leadership table. We had to have the same amount of space, resources, all that kind of stuff. And we had to share and figure out and negotiate how we share. And so that's what we did in that small way, like in an institution. But now we get to educate all the people within about what a treaty is, because they're like, it's based on a treaty, what is that? So who knows what kind of ripple effects that will have. But I needed a sovereign space for Indigenous people within the institution. And I also wanted to create a space for talking about how we're related to each other too, deeply embedded and in a relationship with each other. Needed to do both. And that's something that we struggle with all the time. We're always asking ourselves, do I go over here and make my own thing and just step out of this Canadian system? Do I work within it? I'm like, we always have to be doing both, because we are in relationship with each other. But we also have other concerns that have nothing to do with Canada that we need to work on over here. So it's not a scary thing, it's just how it is. Okay, look, I got us all the way to 2017, barely saying anything at all. I think about criticality in the sense of what we're building. Not in terms of, it's so important that people still do the criticality, like looking at what we've created and what's wrong with it. We need to know these things. People who are combing through the world looking for good options, right? Like how we can go forward. People who are great arguers, because we need to still do the adversarial system. We're still fighting for our rights within the court system. We still have to have people who are good at that. But personally, what I've come to is I'm not interested in doing that work anymore. I can leave that up. I also think in the Anishinaabe system, we have what's called seven sort of stages of life. And there is a stage, which I'm coming into, where you kind of do leave that work to the younger ones, and you get to go into a different space. And the space that I'm interested in is looking at all the ways we open or stop energy and flow. So how do we stop what are the things that we put in the way of the energy from Indigenous communities to flow, to build themselves? How do we stop our children from being happy, healthy adults? Like, what are the things we put in the way? Institutions. How do we stop the energy flowing from the community and back out to the community? What are the things we put in the way? We build this whole society based on ego. Even institutions. The institution itself has an ego. It starts working for itself in its own perpetuation. Who cares if the organization exists? We only care as long as our energy is flowing into it and it's flowing back out to us. Otherwise, get out of the way. I think this is also where the arts is at right now. It's all these huge institutions that have been built and maintained by an unequal system. You have all these little organizations coming up from smaller places, smaller towns, from cultural communities that have been excluded from the arts, from new art forms that haven't existed before, from cultural art forms that aren't valued within the Western system of art. They're fighting to get in, like they're fighting to get something, some way of surviving. They have like this tiny little piece of the pie. So in some ways, we need to get people out of the way so that these people can grow and change and do the work that they need to do. I want to say one last thing, and then I will let you question the shit out of me, okay? I think in terms of the type of personality, I think we have to think about who we are as artists, as cultural workers, as human beings. Because whatever it is we produce in this life actually starts from there. So I think about whenever people want to do consensus decision making, I'm usually the one who says no, which is not a very popular Anishinaabe thing to say because we are so based in consensus. But I also think that the people who were around that table were a different human being than the people I'm sitting with now. So until we unlearn some of the colonial bullshit that's made its way into our bodies and our hearts and our minds, we can't actually do those processes properly and well and healthy. So we have a lot of work cut out for us. And I think artists and the way that people are doing their research in art and the history that artists are doing and cultural workers are doing are actually at the forefront of that kind of thinking and work. So thanks.